Ambedkar King Study Circle for organizing this. Really, it's a pleasure to be back in forums organized by AKSC. And for me, what is really important in continuing to do all the different things that I do with AKSC is the absolutely fascinating depth of involvement you have in the local space that you are in. Diasporic populations have often the problem of only looking, over the oceans to the lands that they come from. But AKSC is remarkable in its commitment to local struggles, commitment to local struggles at the level of, other oppressed communities, labor, workers, etc. And for that, big salute to AKSC for such a deep commitment and fascinating level of involvement. So the other thing that I want to say up front is that I am not in California. I live in New York. So while I have followed the Proposition 22 battle very, very closely because I have been involved with the California work around the passage of AB 5 in my role as the Secretary of the National Taxi Workers Alliance and part of the Executive Council of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. So in that role, I've been very, very involved right from the time of AB 5 being conceptualized. But the person that really I was only hoping to kind of moderate and kind of engage and bring to all of you was Veena Dubal, Professor Veena Dubal from Hastings, and Veena was unable to join because of some personal issues. Basically, it's a very sad situation. Veena's brother went camping last weekend and has not come back. And so we are all struggling to deal with that. And so she's not going to be here, and that's very unfortunate. And I'm sure that sooner than later, you'll all meet Veena also. So having said that, I think Kanak said a lot in the introduction about Proposition 22. What I will do is I will kind of, very quickly kind of walk you through how we've come to this moment. And I'll kind of frame it within a little bit of broader politics. Back in 2017, 2018, there was a case okay, rewind 30 more seconds. So which is, so Uber has been in existence. Let me just give you a little bit of background about Uber and Lyft and all these companies. Uber has been in existence since 2010. And it went for its IPO last year in 2019. And so it's in the 11 years of its existence. Let me give you one simple statistic. The grand total of the amount of profit that Uber has made as a company is a fascinating sum of $0. As a matter of fact, for all of its existence, Uber has consistently lost money. And it's not just lost money, it's lost money in troves. That is, its total losses in 2019 were over $3 billion. Its total losses in 2018 were close to 3 billion, 2.7 billion, etc., etc., etc. So it's a particular model of how the world is structured. That is, the business school pundits will tell you that these are what's called two-sided markets, wherein on one side there's a bunch of people who want to provide a service, and on another side are a bunch of people who want that service. And there's a platform set up in the middle for people of both sides to meet, and that's what this is all about. That's the fairy tale. The reality, of course, is that these are companies that I can do a very, very detailed analysis of Uber, but in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just point to a few more things about Uber, and then we can take it up in Q&A if needed. But the central thing about Uber is that Uber, is the company that is fundamentally premised from the broadest level on this particular moment in the history of capitalism. That is, if you really, we all talk about this thing called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is something that we all understand, financialization of markets, this, that, etc. But there's a way in which we think about neoliberalism as something that started back in the 1970s and has continued through to now in an uninterrupted way, as if what existed as neoliberalism in the 1980s and the 1990s is the same thing that exists as neoliberalism in the 2010s. That's not the case at all. If neoliberalism's initial move was to destroy every element of safety nets, social structure, social safety nets, the welfare state, destroy labor unions, destroy anything and everything that gave ordinary people, specifically workers, power in our societies, then the effect of that, the success of that move that neoliberalism, that the capitalist class made back in the 1970s is visible by the late 90s, early 2000s, in the sense that we always think about capitalism, all the crisis of capitalism, that 2008 there was a meltdown, etc., the financial recession. We always think any of these is somehow connected to capitalist profits. It's exactly the opposite, in the sense that the condition that global capitalism is faced with today is not a shortage of profits. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. From about the late 90s, early 2000s, the condition in terms of one of the macro conditions that capitalism has delivered is that there's an enormous amount of capital desperately searching for spaces of investment, right? That is the condition of capitalism. In Marxist terms, it would be called a condition of a crisis of overaccumulation. That is, capital has turned so profitable in the first 3 decades of neoliberalism that by the early 2000s, there are these giant pools of money sloshing around the world, desperately trying to find spaces of investment. Under those circumstances, a particular thing begins to happen within an already existing structure of financialization. That is, finance capital as a segment of the capitalist class already have hegemonic control over the neoliberal project. And within the finance capitalists, a particular segment of finance capitalists begin to gain even more control under conditions of a crisis of overaccumulation. That is essentially, because there's so much capital that desperately is seeking spaces of investment, the venture capital, private equity segment of finance capital gets to be more and more powerful. And under those circumstances, what you see is the rapid rise from the 1970s all the way to now of that segment of finance capital. And under those circumstances, especially post-2000s, a kind of hegemonic control that class has. And under those circumstances, what we have is the emergence Uber is nothing but a bottom feeder. The other statistic, if this little bit that I've said just now is a kind of a quick and dirty analysis of capital, then the other end, which is workers, from the 1970s to today, that is for 50 solid years, the American worker has seen a flattening of the real wage. That is, real wages haven't gone up for the American worker for 50 years. Now, you put both of these together and you'll be able to explain a lot. For instance, the 2008 meltdown, right? The financial recession. What really happened is that Americans couldn't afford houses. It was done through these, because there's such a lot of pressure from capital to invest, the banking sector flipped all its rules and it went in and all these liar loans were issued and it produced the crisis in the end, right? So Uber is exactly that, in the sense that there's an enormous amount of venture capital backing it. And this venture capital, as it backed it, basically what it does is depend on an economy wherein large number of workers need the gig. That is, their full-time employment is unable to sustain their life. And they need that second employment, third employment, the gig, the 2 hours of work in a day extra, or that 10 hours of work in a week extra, right? That is what they need. right? And that is what, and so it's a bottom feeder in the sense that it depends on workers really struggling, their wages being depressed, and therefore everybody needing additional marginal income. That is what it depends on. And now let me translate that into saying, giving you an interesting statistic. Historically in the United States, the taxi industry, which does exactly what the Uber does, which is take a person from point A to point B, has had a particular pattern of employment or work. That is, 80% of the workforce in a city like Los Angeles or a city like San Francisco or a city like New York has been full-time drivers, and 20% has been part-time. That is part-time students, this, that, people extra, moonlighting for extra income, etc. That ratio, 80-20, would have gone to 70-30 at certain moments, depending on the economy, at worst to 60-40 and things like that, right? When the economy does really well, then the number of full-time taxi drivers may have gone down to 60-65%, 30-35% may have been part-time, etc., right? But Uber, fascinatingly, the number is exactly flipped. 80% of Uber drivers are part-time, 20% are full-time. That's what the logic is, right? Out of this 80% of Uber drivers who are part-time, nearly 50% of Uber and Lyft drivers drive less than 10 hours a week. That is, essentially, they drive 2 hours a week, 2 hours a day on a weekday, or they drive that 8-10 hour over the weekend, right? What this has meant is that the part-time Uber driver comes out for 2 hours, 3 hours during rush hour, kills the business of all the full-time drivers, whether it's taxi or Uber drivers, who are trying to make a full-time living through that industry, because every full-time driver depends on rush hour, the morning rush hour and the evening rush hour, or the weekend rush hours, which is the late night. They depend on those hours for pulling in about 40% of their weekly income. Now, in that period when the 40% of the weekly income is pulled in, if you have a sudden explosion of 200% of drivers on the road, then their income is going to collapse. So essentially what the Uber business model is essentially what I call the part-timization of work. That's essentially what it is. Now, so far so good. This is what Uber was trying to do. This was their business model. Now, in 2017, there was a historic case in the California Supreme Court, what's called the Dynamics decision, wherein a Supreme Court judge simplified the test for employment. He basically said it's a case against it's a case which involved a company called Dynamics, which is again a gig company, and it basically the decision simplified it and said if these three conditions are met, then the person is an employee. If these three conditions are not met, then the person is not an employee. Condition number one is that whether the person sitting in the boss's chair controls significantly the person sitting in the worker's chair, right? If there's enough control, then that person is an employee, right? Number two, is the worker involved in the production or the delivery of the main commodity of the business? And number three, is he or not rated as independent in general terms? That is, does his money come in, let's say, from some other source, or does it come in from the company itself? Based on this, that ruling produced a necessity for the California legislature to produce a new legislation, and that's what AB 5 was, which passed in September 2019 and came into effect on January 1st, 2020. Uber and Lyft are clearly covered in that. DoorDash, Handy, all those people are clearly covered in this. And so their business model is on the verge of collapse. Because if they have to switch to this model, then their business model wherein they thought they could make large amounts of money is about to collapse. I'm not saying that they're going to turn unprofitable or something if they switch to this business model, but that super profit model, the neoliberal super profit model is going to collapse. The interest of venture capital is not being met in this particular frame. And that is why Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and a whole bunch of companies together went for Proposition 22. And Proposition 22, as Kanak mentioned, is the single most expensive ballot proposition in the history of the United States. They've already spent They've already spent over 180 million. By the time November 3rd rolls around, we might even see them go past 200 million. And the previous high for a ballot initiative was just about 100 million, which was by one of the tobacco giants, I think about 25 years ago, right? So this is what we are faced with, right? And so, I mean, there is no question that we must all mobilize and do everything that we can to vote against, to get the no vote against Proposition 22. Let's see, what happens on November 3rd, but we're all very hopeful. There is also, I also wanted to try and get somebody from Rideshare Drivers United, which is California's most important grassroots driver-led organization that exists. It started out in Los Angeles, but now has a base in San Diego as well as San Francisco. And unfortunately, today is the day when they were doing their drivers caravan across the state. And so most of the organizers are too deeply involved in that. And that's when because we realized these dates were conflicting, that's when we came up with the idea of having Veena on this call. But then, of course, what happened was Veena ran into a nightmare of a different variety, and so she couldn't join. So that's where we are now. The good news, I'll give you both the good news and the bad news. The bad news we've already given you. That is, they're spending 180 million. They may spend 200 million by the time this effort ends. But the good news, that's the bad news. And they are literally, I don't think, and most of you are in California, I don't think you can open your front door these days without 3 mailers falling into your apartment or your house. That is all about Prop-22, or you can't switch on television, or you can't switch on your social media without being bombarded with, Prop-22, yes to Prop-22 advertising. And that's the 180 million speaking. The good news is as follows. One, historically, yes to a proposition has always had more difficulty, and no to a proposition has been easier. Number two, the Attorney General of California went to court and got the language on the proposition modified. That is, earlier, Uber had a significant role in writing the language of the proposition. The AG went to court and clearly wrote in the language of exemption from labor law. And normally when exemption is written into a proposition, people look at it with suspicion. So we are hopeful that that is also going to help. Then over the last 15 days, we've been seeing an enormous amount of new organizations coming together to endorse Rideshare Drivers United's position of a no vote on Proposition 22. Just a few days ago, we had Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles endorse. This is a sneak preview, but something similar is coming from the national movement for Black Lives very soon, etc. So we're getting a lot of grassroots support. The labor movement is fairly united, though occasionally there are these rogue unions that go off and try and negotiate some kind of a deal with Uber in the background, and that needs to be stopped. But overall, the labor movement is deeply united in terms of defeating this, as is the legislature. Enough members of the legislature are committed to staying on the course for this proposition. So I will stop here and open up for questions and an engagement, because I think that's going to be more productive than just me continuing to talk. I tried to give a little bit of quick history, and that leads up to this particular moment, this particular conjuncture in terms of a fight, right? In terms of a battle between workers and capital at one end, and between ordinary Californians and big companies like Uber, etc. And I do want to end by going back to what Kanak was saying, that this proposition is really important because, the Uber, Lyft, DoorDash is the tip of the iceberg, right? In the sense that if they get the exemption, then everybody has a script. Here is the exemption rule, and so how do you fit into the exemption? Then tomorrow, all a software company, for instance, or Walmart, or anybody else has to do is to understand that script and make sure that their quote-unquote hiring people is happening as per that script as a way of exempting themselves from labor law, right? So, moment something like this happens, that's going to be the effect. So it's not a vote about Uber or Lyft. It's a vote about literally everybody who's employed in California. And in as much as California, New York, and Texas have such a huge impact on any national policy, it's a vote, so to speak, on stuff that's going to happen across the nation. I mean, for us in New York, we are planning to move for something similar to an ABC test, getting a legislation like that passed. Massachusetts and New Jersey already have it. And so we want to strengthen that space. But if, for instance, Proposition 22 gets passed and our side loses, then, I mean, of course, all of even the efforts in places like New York will run into rougher weather than we anticipate. So this is a fight for all of us. This is really an important battle for every single person who works and is dependent on getting work and getting an hourly wage and getting a fair rate per hour, and that's really the centrality of this battle.